بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Can I take this off? Oh, So we're very excited to be here. This is pretty amazing. Actually, last year we were here at the ICNYU upstairs, actually on the 4th floor. I was here myself, Dr. Rania Awad, Sheikh Rami, and Maulana Bilal, all of which are sort of part of our leadership at Khalil Center. And we did an opening, and it was pretty amazing, the reception that we did get and all the excitement and energy that we did have. Additionally, we've been in contact with Imam Khalid, and he's been very encouraging of the idea of an expansion of Khalil Center into the New York area. And alhamdulillah, with Allah's fadl, we have reached that point where we have actually expanded into the New York area, alhamdulillah. So July 7th is the inception and the opening. And the amazing thing is this incredible kind of collaboration that you see among community leadership that is really changing the way that we talk about mental health, that we are talking about it. Though there's still a lot of work to do, we're talking about it with a lot more openness, with a lot more collaboration between individuals, and you're starting to see that with Khalil Center, alhamdulillah. I just wanted to make a brief note that we are also a Zakat Foundation project. So Zakat Foundation and Khalil Center came together to become Khalil Center became a Zakat Foundation project in the interest of expanding healthcare and mental health care services that is oriented within the Islamic framework. And they really believed in us and they supported us, and so we've come together to combine institutional expertise and track record that they've built in being able to combine that with content. So alhamdulillah, we have expertise in the area of Islamic spirituality and mental health and psychological health. Our team is represented of, as Kamran mentioned, of clinical psychologists, all the allied health professionals. You're going to see some of them here. Sister Manahal, who's here from your own community, is a licensed mental health counselor with a master's as well as an Islamic studies background as well, doing 2 years of Islamic studies officially, formally, and many more informally. Similarly, Sister Sadia Yunus, who's from Long Island, is also here, and she's also has joined the team. And she similarly is a licensed marriage and family therapist in New York, and that she also has an Islamic studies background as well, same program that they studied actually, as well as other years of informal study. Sheikh Murabit, who's of course who's with us today, is a scholar of the Islamic studies who went to study in the West African tradition, which is very interesting because Sheikh Rami is our religious consultant and on the board, and they know each other very well from California. And their wives are also very close friends. Dr. Rania, who heads operations at Khalil Center in the Bay Area, is very close with friends with Dr. Venus Mahmoudi, who is a part of the team here, who's a licensed clinical psychologist, a PhD in clinical psychology. And so, yeah, he's going to have to sort of represent her a little bit too, because she's actually in California right now, and while he's here to sort of channel her spirits into this room, inshallah. We also have Dr. Khalid Al-Zamzami who's sitting to my left, and interesting background, and he's going to hate me for introducing him because he never likes to be introduced. But he studied at Al-Azhar University, and then he also did his MD in psychiatry, and then moved to Qatar to do his residency and is now doing his master's in Islamic studies. And he and I have become very close friends over time and have had an opportunity to collaborate on many projects thinking about the idea of this integration between Islamic studies, our Islamic heritage, intellectual heritage, and mental health practice, and how we sort of bring that together. So we share similar interests in that regard. And so he's going to also address us. And so what I'm going to do is really, Kamran has told you about the services. This is really the beginning of the discussion for us. This is sort of an inaugural kind of program for us here at New York University, at ICNYU, and in the New York area, where we're actually kicking off services. We do a lot of workshops and seminars and lots of mental health initiatives and strategies that we build, and you'll start to see that in the East Coast as time goes by. So you can subscribe to our mailing list. You can kind of get on our Twitter handle and all the social media, as well as follow what's going on in the social media with ICNYU, as we sort of formalize our collaboration with ICNYU. But today what I'm going to do is simply really start the conversation. And I want to I'm going to talk more of what is this idea of integration. So how are we taking health and science and Islamic spirituality? How do they correspond? What's the relationship between the two? And how does our tradition deal with the idea of mental health? Is there any scope for it? What is it about? And how do we think about mental health from an Islamic perspective? And our model, the basis and the framework in which our institution rests upon. And then what you'll see that displayed sort of in action throughout the course of some of the talks that we're going to have, addressing some specific topics, specific areas that are general but yet more of a display of psychological and spiritual wellness and the meaning and attaining personal meaning. So let's start that off now. This is to fill the intellectual gap. This is really interesting. In the Islamic tradition, particularly between the 9th and 14th century and onwards, you had an integration where many theologians were actually trained in the Islamic sciences. And this idea of a distinction or dichotomy between secular and spiritual sciences really didn't exist. And this is very interesting because it follows this trend that's more consistent with how the European intellectual history kind of unravels and unfolds, to an extent where there's an inability to reconcile between faith and science. And at which point there are some scholastic theologians, such as St. Thomas Aquinas and others, Locke was one of them, John Locke attempt to sort of bridge the gap. But as they say, they kind of went down fighting and really lost the battle. And so what you found post-industrial revolution is this separation between church and state, separation between spiritual and health science. Science and spirituality starts to get pieced apart. And in the Muslim context, this is something that this is a foreign concept because it doesn't really ever occur except after post-colonialism, where Muslims become actually more secular than the secularists themselves. They have a greater rejection for spirituality than they do in the United States. In fact, history has evolved in the U.S. towards postmodernism and in the Western world, more so in the West and in the United States and North America than in Europe, where you're finding a greater interest in spirituality and science of spirituality, and finding that it's really impossible to tease apart the human being is a spiritual and a physical being. And it's impossible to tease it apart in a practice or profession or area of health in particular, where you cannot reduce an individual to mechanics, right? How we experience the world, insight, existential crises, spirituality, felt experiences are all very subjective, spiritual elements of our existence. And so psychology really wrestled with this idea. Now, the incredible thing is that within our own tradition, we had a very rich legacy And Dr. Rani actually spoke about this last year of theologians, of spiritual practitioners, of doctors, such as, for example, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, Imam al-Ghazali, Kindi, and the list goes on, of individuals who have addressed the idea of a sort of psychological and spiritual wellness. And what we are doing, really, the core focus and mission is to really revive this legacy in the modern context, in which we can fill this intellectual gap. Our tradition, and Islamic, according to sort of an Islamic foundation, according to our own Islamic creed, is one in which, we accept empirical sciences. There are three sources of knowledge in Islamic theology, and that is that one is the rational sciences, that whenever there's an up, there's a down, right? That nobody can deny that. If there's darkness, there's light, there's opposites to things. Every created thing comes to an end. These are rational truths that we accept as sources of truth. Allah Ta'ala says, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the sky, and the changing of the night and the day, they are ayats. What do we refer to as an ayah? The Quran, right? That's sort of what comes to mind. But here, it's not in reference to Quranic scripture, it's in reference to the cosmos and the changing of the night and sky and empirical knowledge and what you see. And so we accept rational truths, we also accept empirical truths. That there can never be an inconsistency across all of these three things because they all point towards the creation of an ultimate creator, God Almighty. And so we don't dismiss empiricism. In fact, as one of my teachers says, Islam does not dismiss knowledge, it completes it. It's insufficient to say that we are just a physical being. That we are a physical being and we're a spiritual being. We're not either or. This dichotomous relationship is something of this polar extreme. كَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. Indeed, we have made you a moderate nation. Islam in its very nature is moderation and balance. We don't say there's a secular world and a spirit. No, we don't say that there's a physical. No, we say there are all of those things exist, but they all point to an ultimate creator. And so we have this nas, and the other third source of knowledge is wahi, is khabr al-sadiq, which is true reports. And that is that the Prophet, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, came to mankind in order to deliver the message from God in a decisive way, in a conclusive way that cannot be dismissed. Therefore, we say the third source of knowledge here is going to be wahi, scripture and revelation. And we don't have a problem saying that there's a consistency, a necessary consistency you will find between all three sources of knowledge, and that we cannot dismiss them. And if we find a contradiction, it's not really a contradiction, but it's something that we haven't quite understood. And it's for us to be able to discover and find out. And Muslims have been engaged in this intellectual discourse for centuries. And it's our tradition, the richness of this Islamic intellectual legacy, that's really missing, that needs to be filled. That gap needs to be filled. The Prophet ﷺ says, "Al-hikmatu ضالة المؤمن فأينما تجدها فهو أحق بها." أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. That wisdom is the lost commodity of the believer. Wheresoever he or she finds it, he or she is most entitled to it. This is really interesting, to focus on the last part. He or she is most entitled to it. That means we are more deserving of science than scientists themselves. Why? Because the Islamic tradition completes knowledge. It brings it together. It doesn't do this inqita, kind of from its sources, to tease it apart or to separate it from its own source. The worst thing that you can do is to be born to a mother, drink from her milk, benefit from her upbringing, and then when you become strong enough, you turn to her and you say, "You're not my mom." That I break this connection off, right? And so we realize that knowledge is in the service of God. This is where Muslims excelled. And you find across Islamic history where you have the inventions of soaps and technology and advances, all in the service of practicing this deen, algebra, al-jabr. Why? Because we needed to find out how to calculate which way the qibla is, and to be able to mathematically arrive at understanding what alms charity we have to give, our zakat and sadaqah. How do we calculate that, and how do we deal with fractions, because it's been identified to us in the Sharia by an unlettered prophet, right, who has given us the mechanism and the foundation for being able to engage all sciences. And what we are particularly doing is taking the Turath al-Islamiyya, the Islamic intellectual heritage, and as Sheikh Amin, my teacher from Dar al-Qasim always says, representing and representing the Islamic tradition, right? And so we are integrating behavioral science and empirical truths, and we are bringing it together with modern science and our traditions and integrating them together to be able to do this. As an institutional goal, just as a tangible, what do we do? What is this idea of compassion and compassionate care? لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم. Verily there has come to you a messenger from amongst yourselves, somebody who understands you. It's not an angel, the book isn't dropped from the heavens, but a human being that feels what you feel, that he has the Aam al-Huzn, the year of grief. Yes, he feels sadness, and he feels pain, just like everybody else feels pain. وَهُوَ الْبَشَرُ وَلَكَ الْبَشَرُ. He's like a person, but he's not like everybody else, because he has something, an incredible degree of spiritual resilience to be able to stand the tides and the challenges of some of the trials and tribulations that he's faced with, and he is our role model and example for us to be able to draw upon and learn from him as to how we can also engender spiritual resilience as well. So he feels pain and sadness, and there's nothing wrong with it, but he also teaches us how to deal with pain and sadness and grief, which is very important. But these are the resources that we are tapping into, that we want to explore. من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم. That he feels your pain, the pain of the believers. He compassionately and empathically feels your pain and wants well for you, wants to prevent and protect you from dysfunctioning. Ra'uf Rahim, and the two attributes to describe mercy, a character of a consistency of the attribute of mercy. And this is really the sort of Nabi al-Rahmah, the prophet of mercy. He was rahmatil lil alamin, the mercy upon to all humankind. And so we embody this idea that as helping professionals, as caring providers, as a community, it is necessary for Muslims to have spaces and people to go to that they can turn to in times of need and crisis and distress. And in fact, we consider this to be a fardul kifaya, a communal obligation, in which if we don't provide this, just like if we don't have a mosque, we don't have a hospital, then we will collectively sin, because we have this idea of an ummah, a collective body of believers that are interconnected, that one part of it feels the pain of the other, and if we don't, then we will all be accountable for that. Therefore, there are a group of us who have to have the degree of expertise and training to be able to offer those various services. And this is what we are doing, and this is why you also see the expansion of Khalil Center. The necessity to provide an integrated mental health system that is professional, that is mainstream, that is licensed, rooted and grounded within the Islamic tradition, in order to spread and to spread what? Spread the kindness, spread the love, right? هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله. That it is He who has sent His messenger with the risala, with the message, so that it may rise above all other ways and modalities. So this is what makes us most entitled to this science, is because we can do justice to its representation by connecting it to its source. By being able to show as an exemplar institution, to say that we stand upon a legacy and tradition in which we do not have a problem of faith and science. We've inherited that problem. And we don't have the problem, we in fact contain the solution. And so we want to show it rather than speak to it. Let's prove it. It's time for us to get off, our soapboxes and get on the streets and to provide these services. And so now we get even more specific. That the Prophet ﷺ says, "Man nafasa an muslimin kurbatan min kurab ad-dunya nafasa Allahu anhu kurbatan min kurab yawm al-qiyamah." Thus, whosoever relieves the suffering, the burdens of a believer, Allah Ta'ala will relieve his suffering and his burdens in this world and in the akhirah. And then we have what? Al-majalisu bil-amana. Man satara ala muslimin satarahu Allahu fi dunya wal-akhirah. That whosoever conceals the faults of a believer, or rather in our terms, professional terms, keeps confidential and covers up the faults of a believer, then Allah Ta'ala will cover his faults in this dunya and the akhirah. Wallahu fi awni al-abdi ma kana al-abdu fi awni akhihi. That Allah is in the service, will help his servant in so much as he helps his brother or sister in mankind. Right? الخلق كلهم عيال الله وأحب الخلق إليه أنفعهم لأعياله. That the creation are dependents of Allah, like the family, but dependents of Allah. And the best of the creation are those who are most beneficial or good. In another narration, أحاسنكم لعياله. That the best of them, the most kind and the most good to his creation, to his dependents. And so that's the legacy in which we sit upon. And so how do we do it? This is where we have this integration. I'll just show you just a couple of brief slides, inshallah. Mental health, and forgive the Arabic, I will translate it, inshallah. That we have this concept of medicine as an Islamic science, tib, right? Medicine. Within tib, we have different specialities. So we have mental health, which Abu Zayd al-Balkhi has his own risala on, but it's connected to the larger work in which you have the body and the soul, right? The treatment of the body and the soul. And so in this so we have tib, mental health, that's at the core, but we have all of these things that necessarily are connected to it. In order to claim it as an Islamic science, it has to be connected to the Islamic sciences, to the core foundational Islamic sciences and principles. One of which is al-fiqh al-akbar, which is our aqidah, our creed, our basic foundational theology, discursive theology, which informs what? Our perspective and lens upon in which we view the world.
Could you explain what you mean by discursive theology?
Our creed, essentially our belief system, if we were to just simply make it simple for the purposes of this lecture. We have our creed, our foundational belief system in which we view the world. So in mental health, for example, an example is we say that there's a hadith Qudsi of the Prophet ﷺ that says, I am according to the way that my servant conceives of me. So our lens in which we see the world, that we believe and we say that and an example is that what I stated earlier is that we have these three sources of knowledge. This comes from our very discussions of creed. Who is God? How do we relate to God? How do we understand the nature of God? What are His attributes? and how we come to know of him, that is necessarily influences and directs some of our discussion in mental health. Other issues, we have fiqh al-zahir, which is basically our outer conduct. This is what we know as generally Islamic law, when we refer to it as Islamic law or fiqh, is the ritual rules and laws or criminal civil law, right? So getting married, how you get married, but ritual law. So examples of that will actually, in fact, probably be displayed in Dr. Khalid's talks. That some of these brief examples might be that if an individual experiences certain mental illnesses, there are what we call rukhas, or dispensations that may be afforded to them. That some of the rules that normatively apply to that individual may change and become altered. So we need to know this in order to be able to most effectively administer a mental health system or mental health practice in which we are aware and grounded within Islamic theology. In certain instances, an individual may not be required to pray. In certain instances, they might not be accountable for some of the things that they do. In certain instances, they might not be required to fast. In some instances, they shouldn't fast, right? When you have certain mental conditions. In fact, in the discussion of before the first 4 months of abortion, right, prenatally, that in the first 4 months of pregnancy, that if there is some discussion, especially among the Hanafis, regarding whether an abortion would be permissible or not, and one of the legal criterion is the mental status and harm that might be associated with giving birth to that child. And so we don't sometimes know of these things. So the interesting thing is that the conversation isn't about whether mental health is real or mental illness is real. That's a really superficial discussion, because anybody who has any familiarity with the Islamic tradition knows that it's a fundamental sort of part of how we understand the human being, right? That it's impossible to dismiss it. It means if you've either been blinded or you've inserted a lens in which you understand the language of mental health and you can't relate it to what Islamic theology has to say. The other component is al-fiqh al-batin, which is the internal sciences. How you think, how you believe. Having husn al-dhan, for example, positive optimism. I'm oversimplifying for the purpose of this conversation, for beginning the conversation. Having a good perspective. Not having certain spiritual illnesses, amrad al-qulub, the diseases of the heart. These are important considerations because we have in modern mental health research a questioning by many scholars, mental health scholars in modern behavioral science, that question this dichotomy between health and illness, and there's nothing in between. That health means the absence of illness, which is not true. Because they did some studies to show just because you don't have a mental illness doesn't mean you're very happy. Or satisfied, rather. And there's a discussion that's changing from happiness to contentment and satisfaction, which is very interestingly shifting towards higher order meaning rather than pleasure seeking. And the irony is that selflessness increases positive mental health as long as it's associated with higher meaning. This is where the science is going. And what does our tradition have to say about that? There's a lot. There's a lot that our tradition has to say about this integration between mental health and Islamic sciences. Khalil Center exists within the context of other Islamic spaces. That it's not disconnected from other spaces, as it traditionally existed in in Islamic history pre-colonialism. That in fact in modern day Turkey you have that was built in the 15th century, a hospital, mental hospital, in which it situated directly next to a mental health hospital, a madrasa. That's a madrasa, traditional seminary that's next to a hospital. It's not until recently we started deinstitutionalizing in mental health today. That that we used to institutionalize, and now we're moving towards community-oriented health, in which we have this tradition where you have necessary spaces within the Muslim context. It's not the masjid alone, but it's the masjid, it's the hospital system, it's the seminary, it's the khanqa or the zawiya or the taqiyya, the spiritual lodge, in which you would have people who are proficient in behavioral change. And whenever it was outside of their scope, they would be referred to physicians, a hakim, hikmah, right? They would go to a what we would in today's terms call a physician. They would go to a physician. But they too would recognize them. When somebody was in a hospital, they would have 4 people assigned to a bed, one of which was a chaplain that was in charge of the spiritual care and wellness and experience of the individual within the hospital. And so this is our gold mine to be able to dig up. Now, I'm not claiming that we have we have all the answers to behavioral science. No. Allah's knowledge is infinite. Right? And so it will the wisdom and the rules and the system in which God fashioned the world and human nature, we will discover through some of the various different sources of knowledge, some of which will be informed by the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, some of which will be alluded to by the Quran, some of which will be discovered by modern behavioral science. And we bring it together in a comprehensive way to be able to address human functioning. And so then we have these principles of change within our framework. So these 3 principles of change we have according to our psychotherapeutic model, which looks at a human being and says that there's this concept of inkishaf or introspective awareness, unveiling, knowing yourself. To know yourself and your deficiencies and your strengths, your weaknesses and your strengths. And then once you can do that, then what do? We have an i'tidal, psycho-spiritual equilibrium. We want to balance, make sure that you become balanced. Okay? And then lastly, you have an integrative ittihad or ma'rifah, kind of an interconnectedness where all these things come together in the service of God. And so, and I'll translate this for you. This is a statement of Imam al-Ghazali. He says, قال صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا أراد الله بعبده خيرا بصره بعيوب نفسه. That if God wants a good for a believer, for a slave, then he will give him awareness of his own deficiencies. And then he says, for this modality, in order to do this, there's a traditional modality, which is أَيَجِزْ بَيْنِ يَدَيَ الشَّيْخِ مِنْ مَشَايِخِهِ. To go and take on a spiritual mentor, a scholar of the spiritual sciences, traditional scholar, an Islamic scholar, and to make him somebody whom you're going to confide in order for him to help you gain awareness. And there's going to be 2 things that might happen. One is وَتَارَةً يَنْكَشِفُ لَهُ. Sometimes what he does is he becomes preoccupied with what the sheikh tells him to do. And then what he does is he tells, and then he realizes that, my sheikh told me to go and clean the washrooms today. I'm on washroom duty. I'm like a PhD in clinical psychology. How dare you do that? Why doesn't he get somebody else to do that? And so then I feel the pain, the discomfort. And then I have this awareness, oh, this feels like pride. This isn't good. I'm having a very difficult time complying with the request. And then what happens, and sometimes that doesn't happen, and the sheikh will point it out. He's just grunting and whatnot, and then he goes. And then the sheikh comes over and says, did you notice that you had a very difficult time when I asked you? You really hesitated. You really hesitated there. How difficult was this task for you? And so there's this awareness, I didn't recognize that. I'm making the connection now. And so sometimes he points it out, but the very interesting thing is, he says, look, this is so important, so part of our tradition, that there's also a second modality. You know what? If you have there's also another way to do this. And the other one is to take a رفيقا صالحا عالما بأسرار هذا الأمر. Take a mentor, a righteous companion who is knowledgeable with the intricacies of this matter, of how to help you change. This is where the scope of Khalil Center's providers are, this integration, that we are not a replacement of the traditional seminary, we're not a replacement of a traditional spiritual lodge or zawiya or khanqa or taqi or anything, but what we are is to say, just as is necessary for every Muslim to know basic things about their religion in order to how to pray. You don't need to go to a seminary for 6 years, 7, 8 years in order to pray. طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم. Knowing is mandatory for every believer to know that much of their religion, which is necessary for them to be able to practice in life. So that is an intellectual one. But what about all of the internal components of us? The way in which we interact with our spouse, the way that we deal with our children, the way that we deal with suffering, the way that we deal with our neighbors, the way that we deal with living in a non-Muslim society as a religious minority, the way that we deal with being a psychologist or a lawyer or a physician or a working professional. All of these things are necessary to have some introspective space or place, and this is what we're putting together to say that we not only deal with clinical disorders, we're trained to do that, but we're also trained to do non-subclinical or spiritually psychological kind of laden issues in which we're trying to advance and make the individual a better, more functioning person, just as Imam Khalid did. He's got lots of spiritual resiliency, mashallah. But Imam Khalid made himself vulnerable in this audience here today to say that I even go to a therapist to discuss some of these issues. And lastly, this is our Islamic framework of the human psyche, of the human being, of the different components of the human being, which fit within our Islamic kind of framework. So the heart is at the heart of it all. Pun intended, right? ألا إن في الجسد مضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله إذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله. That know that there is a piece of flesh within your body, and Dr. Khalid informed me this week that it's not just the metaphysical; it's actually the physical heart within the chest that has both metaphysical and spiritual. It's both the spiritual and the physical. That is the store of all of the life force of the spiritual self, right? And it has different components that it manifests itself in the form of nafs, which is your behavioral inclinations, your desires. We don't believe your nafs to be evil. In fact, we believe everybody is born on the fitrah. كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. Everyone has a good core. But we have to nurture that good core. How? Through balancing. And this is a lifelong process for all of us. To balance our thinking, to balance our behaviors and our inclinations, to balance our spiritual life. That we're not, that everything has a haqq for it, has a responsibility. That I don't say, look, I'm going to travel around for Khalil Center, which I'm probably doing a bad job of managing, but travel around for Khalil Center and do all this work, but then I'm going to neglect my family, which I may be guilty of. Okay? So that I have to go back and somebody's got to check me and say, wait, you're going to take care of everybody else, you're not going to take care of your own family members. That's imbalanced. We don't get into religious service only and then we neglect all of these other responsibilities. That's not Islam. We don't have a confining yourself to the monastery and saying, I'm never going to get married. So an extreme on the spiritual self. I'm going to just stay in the monastery, in the spiritual lodge and take prayer beads and just stay there, and that's all I'm doing. That's the rest of my life. No, it's you will get married. In fact, whosoever doesn't is not from my sunnah, is the statement of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? And so everything has its due balance. And so this is what we are trying to do, is to say, We want to strike this balance, and ultimately the imbalance leads to the rusting of the heart. كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. That the heart rusts on account of what you do. And by imbalancing, your heart is going to rust. And so the goal is to say, this is our conception of the human being, is that they're physical and they're spiritual, and that this is a lifelong process. And the Sharia is known as a tariq, literally lughatan. Linguistically, it means a pathway. And the pathway to staying on moderation, and when we divert, we try to get back on. And so there's this sort of consistency of maintaining mentorship in order to help us do that. And sometimes we divert way too far, and we need some more serious intervention. And sometimes it's, we take a detour, which, mashallah, you guys have a lot of in New York. I feel like New York and New Jersey is traffic and construction is almost never ending. Subhanallah. So the frustration that everybody feels with the traffic over here and the aggression and sort of all of that. So we need somebody to moderate it. Come to Chicago. Come to the Bay Area every now and then. Visit our Khalil Centers from the New York office to the California. Or come right in the middle. The best of that which is in the middle. Come to Chicago. Right? Come right down the center. And so this is our tradition. This is our legacy. To be able to nurture this health and spaces and places and avenues to be able to do that. And that is the ultimate goal upon which Khalil Center is founded upon and upon which it stands. And you will see throughout the course of today other conversations around this very theme of being able to strike this balance. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين جزاكم الله خيرا. So I will hold off questions. What my suggestion is that we're going to have a panel discussion. My suggestion is that you note it down. Perhaps I said something and then Sister Manahil or Dr. Khalid might address it before you've given him the chance to, and your question may become answered. So during the panel conversation, you'll have a lot of opportunities to ask not only myself or the team, but also Imam Khalid and Imam Suhaib, despite their humility in saying that we're the experts, because he just basically broke down for you like empathy over here and compassionate care, which I took a week to teach in Hartford Seminary for the past week that I've been here. Barakallahu feekum. I'll ask Dr. Khalid to join us to start us off, and then we'll transition to Sister Manahil. Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullah khair.